Welcome to the panel. For those just joining us, this is a panel on Caribbean slavery. Initially, it was going to have 4, and now we have 2 panelists, Marjoleine Kars and Vince Brown. Vince is actively trying to get in. I'm sure he will in just a minute. So we're going to reverse the order, and Marjoleine's going to go first. We're going to try to treat this as much as a roundtable as possible. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then they will spend just a few minutes giving an overview of their book in case some of you have not read them. I know many of you probably have. And then I'm going to raise a couple of questions, sort of town hall style, and they're going to sort of to get conversation going. And as that happens, feel free to queue up your questions, and then we'll start into the conversation that's involving everybody. We do hope to devote most of the time to Q&A and discussion. I will just say that this panel was a wonderful opportunity for me to revisit these 2 books, which are both truly phenomenal. And I don't say that very often. These are really exceptionally rich books, both in terms of research and in terms of writing. The interpretive interventions are sort of multiple in both cases. And, as someone who spent just a little bit of time trying to reconstruct a few days in 1 year in Martinique, the ability to reconstruct these timelines and the geographies and the different factions in these things, it blew me away that you were able to do that, both of you. So a quick introduction. Our first presenter will be Professor Marjoleine Kars, who teaches at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She has 2 books out. Her first book was Breaking Loose Together, The Regulated Rebellion in Pre-Revolutionary North Carolina. And then, of course, the book she'll be talking about today, Blood on the River. You'll hear more about that in a minute. The one thing I did want to mention is that there was an article that came out in advance of this in the AHR. And I think it might be the most decorated article I've ever heard of. I think you won like 5 article prizes for it. But it looked at the gender politics in this uprising that this book is about. I think it's a wonderful article. I've taught it before, and students at both undergraduate and graduate levels really enjoy it. Vince, good to see you. Glad you're able to make it. So our second presenter, I guess, should we go back in original order now that Vince is on?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So our first presenter, introducing, probably needs no introduction, just like the first, but Vincent Brown, Charles Warren Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, also Director of Undergraduate Studies and making movies and digital websites. Obviously widely known for his 2 books, in addition to all of the digital and film work that he's done. His first book, Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, was awarded the Emerald Curdy Prize, the James Raleigh Prize, and the Louis Gottschalk Prize. And then, of course, the current book that he'll be talking about today, Tackies Revolt. I should mention that both books have been either shortlisted or awarded multiple prizes as well, including the Frederick Douglass Prize, the one in Canada, the Kundal Prize, which is a biggie, and all the rest. So anyway, we're going to go just like we mentioned. Vince will talk for a few minutes. Marjoleine will talk for a few minutes, and then we'll just go into some questions. So thank you for joining us.
Glad you made it, Vince.
You're up.
Yeah, sorry that that was so traumatic. The show must go on.
All right, and you're up.
Great. So I'm afraid that my speaker wasn't working during Professor Rushforth's introduction, but I think I know what we're doing here. I just want to thank both of you, Professor Rushforth and Professor Kars, for joining me on this panel. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, in part because I respect and admire your work so much. So I just wanted to kind of give a very brief introduction to what I was trying to do with this book, the kind of principal interventions I was hoping to make. The first one was really about the geography of our historical imagination. If we think back to Edward Said's work and our Orientalism in the 1970s, one of the things that Edward Said was really concerned with were these kind of invidious distinctions we made between places and the people in them that obscured the kind of histories of interaction that produced our knowledge of these places, where these people were produced through the interactions. And Orientalism, as a kind of discourse about the Middle East, actually obscured all of those interactions. Now, I want to do the same kind of thing with African history. We have known, especially since the work of John Thornton in Africa and Africans in the Atlantic world, we have known for a long time about the demography of the Americas, in which down to about 1800, some 3/4 of all the people who migrated to the Americas migrated from Africa. And yet we know far, far more about that minority of European immigrants to the Americas and their history than we do about the history of these Africans who migrated to the Americas. Now, we've got a broad body of research on African cultural contributions to American cultural life, but we don't yet know very much about how African political developments, transformations within African history, actually reverberated through the Americas. So I think my first mission in this book, and the contribution I hope to make, was to really get us thinking about how these regions are interconnected, not just demographically, not just culturally, not just economically, but politically, in terms of the kind of moment by moment, era by era political histories that we often tell about other places. And so for that, the idea was to take Tackies revolt, this series of revolts really that occurred in Jamaica in 1760 and 1761. And as many of you will know, Jamaica was Britain's most profitable colony in the Americas in the mid-18th century. And take Tackies revolt and use it as a kind of window onto that connection between African and American history, to show how that the events in Jamaica were in some ways reverberations, but unique ones, distinct ones, of that African history. So I'm hoping to kind of be a bridge in that between the Africanists who've been asserting for a very long time that African history matters in the Americas, and the Americanists who haven't quite made all of those connections, even though they're aware of the contribution that Africanists have made. So I'm trying to kind of be a hint. This book tries to be a hinge between those two historiographies, which, though we have a lot of great Africanists working in Atlantic history, a lot of great Caribbeanists who think and read about African history, I don't think that we have very many books which make that connection very secure and sound. So that was one issue. The second major thing was to see this history of slave revolt as a war story. We often think of the history of slave revolt mostly in terms of race relations or racial politics, as something that tells us something about relations between masters and slaves, or Black people and white people, something that occurs on a particular plantation or in a particular colony. But what I wanted to do was use the category of war to stretch the canvas, so we could really highlight and feature these questions of tactics, aims, territorial ambition that one sees certainly in Professor Kars's work, but one sees more kind of resolutely in the history of warfare than one often sees in the history of slave revolt. And for that, it became crucial to think about Tackies revolt as a war within a network or a series of other wars. So of course it was that race war between Black people and white people as an event in itself. But it was also, as I said, an extension of African politics and warfare on the Atlantic African coast. So you had various African empires vying for supremacy behind the coast, and whenever they went to war, soldiers would be captured, enslaved, sold to the Europeans, and they often came out to the Americas and they regrouped, sometimes even former enemies coming together in new categories of belonging with new affiliations because they spoke similar languages or worshiped similar gods vis-a-vis other Africans. And then they staged revolts against plantation society, which had their knock-on reverberations around the world. So again, this war was an extension of these African wars. It was also, as a result of these pre-existing conflicts, a war for communal belonging among enslaved peoples in Jamaica, between different kinds of Africans, between African-born and Creole-born people, and between other kinds of enslaved peoples, and enslaved and free Blacks. At the same time, it was, and most obviously, a major battle in the 7 Years' War between Britain and its imperial antagonists, most famously France throughout the 18th century. And despite the fact that, this is Britain's most profitable, most politically significant, and most militarily significant colony, most historians of the 7 Years' War have written Tackies rule out of their understanding of that event, in part because it's a slave revolt, and therefore we always already know historiographically that it's something distinct, that it's something different. So Fred Anderson's 600 or 700 page book on the 7 Years' War as a global war, which it was, doesn't really include Tackies revolt at all. Doesn't mention it, I think. This despite the fact that many of the soldiers, sailors, Marines who fought in more famous campaigns in the 7 Years' War in Quebec and Martinique and Guadeloupe and Senegal went to Jamaica to suppress this slave revolt. So from the soldiers' perspective, it was very much part of the same war. I'm writing it back into that history of imperial warfare as well. And then finally, when one looks at the kind of, the rare evidence of enslaved testimony about their ambitions in this period, one sees the enslaved describing slavery itself as a state of war. And very early on, I cite Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, one of the most famous autobiographers who's formerly enslaved, who actually served in the British Royal Navy for a time as well. And he said, when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he wasn't being metaphorical, right? He had been in Jamaica in 1772 with the island still reeling from these campaigns of the 1760s. And so I wanted to take that literally and see slavery itself as a state of war, which was answered by warfare from these Africans who arrived in Jamaica in 1760 and 61. So that's a kind of brief description of just what I was trying to get at with the book, and hopefully successfully.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was perfect. Marjoleine, take it away.
I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, now I think I'm good. So since I'm not dealing with a revolt that's as well known as Tackies in Jamaica, I should probably explain that I wrote a book that deals with a slave revolt in a Dutch colony called Berbice, later became British Guiana, and it's now the Republic of Guyana, wedged between Venezuela and Suriname. And this was a small Dutch colony, and a major revolt broke out early in 1763. The enslaved take over pretty much the entire colony, stay in control for more than a year. Takes the Dutch a long time to get their battered colony back. And it's a revolt that almost changed the face of American history. Takes place very much at the beginning of that age of revolution that Vince already mentioned too. So that's one of the contexts in which I try to put it. It's a book that deals with the enslaved folks, both those who supported the rebellion, those who dodged the rebellion, and those who opposed it. Deals with the various Dutch folks, the colonists there, but also Dutch soldiers who are sent from the Dutch Republic, as well as from nearby colonies. And it deals with the Native American allies of the Dutch who fight on the side of the Dutch for the great part. The book is based on a very lucky archival find. It turns out that for this rebellion, there are about not only the usual colonial archives, so the governor kept an extensive daily journal where he wrote about whom he met and who came to him and who said what and what his spies told him. Lots of military reports by soldiers, correspondence between officials, all that sort of stuff that you always have. But the more amazing part of it is about 500 pages of investigations, as the Dutch call them, that were taken from witnesses and participants in the rebellion, all of them enslaved people, afterwards, as the rebellion is being suppressed. And almost 900 people, 898, I think, which amounts to more than half of the remaining adults, are questioned. And my second unusual bit of evidence is that the leader of this rebellion, a man who named himself Governor Kofi, twice engages in written diplomacy with the Dutch governor. And these letters form also a sort of an unusual part of this archive. So the archival base that I had allowed me to write a story about a slave rebellion that's really from the inside out, as opposed to more often the outside in. I came to this rebellion having previously worked on the American Revolution, and like Vince, was trained at Duke with social historians like Larry Goodwin and Peter Wood and Barry Gaspar and Ray Gavins, who taught us to always look at events from the view of the oppressed and to be suspicious of people in power, even if those folks in power were movement people. And so, having written about the American Revolution, I was very aware that in that anti-colonial struggle, there was also a huge struggle, of course, over who would rule at home. And a number of different visions of freedom emerged. And so I was really interested to see whether a slave rebellion would be, particularly a long-lasting one like this, would be equally complex. And I think that I found that it is. And so part of what I wanted to do was pull slave rebellions, much like Vince was talking about, out of this sort of historiographical corner where they are always considered sui generis, in their own category, rather than being seen as complex freedom struggles on par with all the other freedom struggles that we see in the Age of Revolution. And I was very interested then too in looking not only at the relations between enslaved and enslavers, which of course in a revolt is important, but at the relationships, the vertical relationships among the enslaved themselves. And I think that my evidence really lent itself to that. And so a big part of the book is looking at the various motivations that enslaved people have to join or oppose or dodge the rebellion. And these motivations are related to divisions within the enslaved community, ideas about the desirability of war, but also different visions of Black freedom. And so in that respect, I think the book is not only a very dense social history of enslaved people in a state of war, but it helps us think about sort of the intellectual history, the political vision of African descended people at this time. And in it, I argue, I'm really trying to rescue the dodgers from the sort of condescension of historiography. And I'm trying to say that the folks who do not appear to want to be deeply involved in this rebellion are not only doing so because rebellions are scary, they are, and they're dangerous, but also because they have a vision of what freedom ought to be that's different from that of the rebels. And so I see dodging in some ways as a declaration of independence that people make with their feet rather than by writing. And so the book is a social history focused on the voices of the enslaved through the voices of the enslaved. That also, I hope, makes a contribution to intellectual history. And in part because I wanted to make an intervention in the Netherlands, where Dutch involvement in slavery, believe it or not, is only apparently just coming to people's consciousness. I wrote the book as much as I could as a narrative, so that people would want to read it because it was a compelling story, but that in the process they would learn something that the Dutch really need to grapple with. So that helped shape the book. Not only the fact that it lent itself to a narrative treatment, but that I thought it would be more read if I wrote it that way.
All right, excellent, thank you. I guess, is the Dutch translation, it's out now or almost out?
It is out, and it's been interesting because the publisher did not ever want to use the word slave, which I avoid a lot in the book, but when I'm talking about a legal category, I use it. And so they didn't really want to use it. And so a lot of the Dutch reviewers, while they've liked the book a lot, have felt compelled to talk about the politically correct nature of the language, which seems to me to be, given how we're all struggling to find a language with which to tell these incredibly violent and important stories, a really sort of, I'm not sure I want to be recorded saying this, but petty, petty criticism, and an interesting one. I think it speaks to some reluctance to engage these issues.
Yeah, well, in fact, my first question actually oh, sorry, Vince, you had something? Were you going to?
Well, no, I think that would be a good place to start, and we could get into that, because I also use slave and enslaved interchangeably, and I don't think that that is, the most important question we're asking here. I understand why people are reticent to use the word slave, and the argument goes, if we just call these people slaves, then we're not acknowledging their personhood. But when you get a book like Marjoleine Kars's book, and it's got the enslaved at the very center of the story, and their personhood is not even in question. We're not doubting that at all, right? To acknowledge the fact that legally they are slaves and that is what they're revolting against. I think we need to use the word slave in that context, right? Otherwise, we're just not being historically specific enough. Like, Marjoleine Kars and I have no problem understanding that slavery is a predicament, that slavery itself doesn't define someone's subjectivity, right? We already know that. So we don't have to kind of, use our language and find the exact term that conveys that. What we can do is show you how slavery itself and slave, even if you call someone a slave, no matter what, their personhood is still there, right? We don't question that. So whatever you want to call them, everything we have to say about them suggests that they are, in fact, they see themselves as persons and not merely as chattel, not merely as things. And then I don't think we have to worry so much about the language and finding the precise term that is supposed to convey all of those things that, people think enslave conveys more than slave. In fact, the way we tell our stories conveys that, whereas the meaning of the word, I actually don't think it can be fixed in the way the advocates for a change in language think it can anyway.
Yeah. Well, it certainly shows how language plays a highly political role in a developing conversation in a country like the Netherlands, where the publisher was adamant. I made all these arguments, Vince, and they would not hear of it. And so it means that the translation does not follow quite the way I do it in the English version. And it does at times become very clunky. But I think that nevertheless, the vision in the book is so much more important than the precise terms chosen, that I wish people would engage the arguments rather than the fact that occasionally the translation is clunky. And, since I'm a Dutch speaker, I can tell that myself. But it's what the publisher decided. And I'm still glad it's out there in Dutch, because there are plenty of people who don't read English well enough to want to read a 250-page book in English.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, speaking of terminology, another term that I think both of you grapple with really effectively in this is the question revolt, uprising, insurgency, but war, really, right? And this gets to Vince's point in his introductory remarks about the sort of nature of this conflict as an extension of West African political and military contexts. And I'm wondering how that intersects, I guess, with sort of other literature on slave resistance. Both of you talk about how there are these ways of framing rebellions, wars for liberation as sort of the most extreme thing on a continuum. It could start with breaking the hoe, it could end with, taking over an entire colony. But the argument here seems in both cases to be that this is something somewhat different, and that the military engagement, is not only in the negative to undo slavery, but also has a vision that is, positive in the sense that they have a concrete idea of what they're moving toward rather than what they're just moving against. So I know that's kind of a fuzzy way of framing that question, but if you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of where the idea of war and where the idea of resistance comes in, and are there ways those two are in tension?
You want to take that, Marjoleine? You want to start?
Yeah, sure. The people, Black Berbetians themselves talk about war. They talk about, when the war came, or they mention the war a lot. The word revolution is actually used by the Dutch. They call it a revolution. The enslaved themselves do not use that word. I have a somewhat different relationship, I think, to the word war than Vince does. I mean, and that's why I was waiting for him perhaps to speak first, because I certainly understand Vince's point that that enslaved people are always engaged in a war, in the sense that the relationship between enslavers and enslaved is always antagonistic, and people are forever pushing back. But in the case of Berbice, I think the very fact that it becomes a military war, literally, is also what makes many people not want to be a part of it. That does not mean that those people want to be enslaved by the Dutch. Absolutely not. And they take advantage of the war to plunder their masters' houses and to take back what their labor has wrought. But then they want to be left alone. And I think that's partly because of the vision that the rebels stand for, but it's also because a military struggle has a lot more to offer, despite the dangers, to younger men with military experience than it does many other folks in the community, whether these be women, children, older people, Creoles with much less fighting experience. And so, to me, I actually see the rebellion as having a very strong military side, obviously, but I also see that war as something that people react against. And when they talk about when the war came to our plantation, they're not talking about something they're excited about always. So I think because my sources allowed me to see not only the rebel leaders and what the rebels were doing militarily, but what people were doing during the rebellion for this long period of time, I think I could see more maybe what do you call that, the home side of war, the way in which a rebellion takes over the entire colony and everybody then gets pulled in whether they want to or not. But that doesn't necessarily, and so people get pulled in even when they're trying not to be. And so I'm not being very articulate about it, but to me, the word war denotes something quite specific, and I would actually prefer to see it as somewhat separate from that constant struggle and tension and antagonism that is always there between enslavers and enslaved people. But yeah, I think that's partly the nature of the sources and the type of intervention we're trying to make.
I think that's absolutely right. It's both of those things, but it also is a choice. I've made the kind of explicit and conscious choice to generalize the term war, to broaden it, to make it more capacious, to sweep in things that we generally don't think of as warfare. And I've got a couple of reasons for that. So the first one is that, I'm impressed, as many people are still, by Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, in which his kind of handy, convenient general definition of slavery is as the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons, right? That everywhere he looked in his study of 66 slave societies from ancient to modern across the world, violence was the common denominator, and often quite organized violence, right? From the part of the slaveholders, but also connected up to the militias and the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I see the enslaved themselves talking about slavery itself as a state of war, and one sees this across, I'm very influenced by Manuel Barcia's work on African warfare in Cuba and Brazil, and by John Thornton's work, of course, as I mentioned, but also by Ada Ferrer's Cuba's Mirror, in which she talks about the enslaved regularly talking about slavery itself as a state of low-intensity warfare, right? Which means that the kind of conventional military campaigns that usually would leave out a slave revolt altogether, as in the case of the 7 Years' War, as I mentioned, right? Those don't exhaust the category of warfare for me. right? So a lot of those kind of choices that people are making, say, to take advantage of the chaos and go and loot and then dodge the conventional military campaign, that to me is part of a general state of war. Now, I will say that I kind of have personal reasons for doing that. And it's partly to understand like my own position as someone who was born in 1967 at the height of the Vietnam War and raised through the late Cold War and into the Terror War. In San Diego, California, for the most part, which is one of the largest military garrisons in the history of the world. And I look on my like little more than half century of existence, and I've been living in a country that has been in a permanent state of warfare. I can't tell you a 5-year period where the United States wasn't abroad somewhere engaged in combat with somebody. That's continuous warfare. Right. And the state is organized. And certainly my town was organized for a state of continuous warfare. So kind of my domestic activities are in some ways a part of that larger state of warfare. And I'm quite intentionally sweeping those in because we haven't considered those to be warfare, because it's too easy for us to disconnect ourselves on the domestic front, right, from what is going on abroad that we're paying our taxes for, that's being done in our name, and that our, even our cultural discourse is organized to kind of get us to approve of and to legitimate. Now, there are virtues and limitations to that, right? And I can already hear kind of, you thinking this way is, if everything is war, then what's not war, right? And that is a question I have a harder time answering, because what I'm doing is using war as an optic which allows us to see the connections of these various behaviors in a way that we normally would exclude them analytically a priori, and not see how the various connections on the home front or the domestic front that are not part of the formal military campaigns are in fact fundamentally connected to it, right? So that's what I'm trying to do, and I know that I've made a choice that doesn't allow me then analytically to distinguish war from not war, but I'm happy with that choice. I feel comfortable with that choice. It's a choice that allows me to see some things that I think have been obscured, and it's a choice that allows me to see some things, as I said, in my own life and my own country that have been obscured, and maybe quite intentionally, for these last 50 plus years.
And of course, and that's true of all choices we make in our work, right? That some of the choices we make allow us to see things and they obscure others. So I think it's one of the reasons why the books work well together. I've heard of several people that they have assigned them either half the class reads one and the other class the other, and they debate it, or they
That's great,
both,
yeah.
and because they go together very nicely, because we're talking about situations that are remarkably similar. I mean, I was just looking at your book again this morning and noted how often in the margin it says CF.B, meaning this is just like in Berbice, or this so compares to Berbice. And of course, they're so close together.
Well,
even
I mean,
though they
that's
take
the other
place
thing, is
in
that
vastly different places.
Yeah, there are the analytical similarities, but there's also the historical connections, right? We're writing about events that are just a couple of years apart, and often involving people from the same part of West Africa, right? So this is in some ways a similar history playing out. It's a history of diaspora, a similar African history playing out in two different colonies in roughly the same time period. You stack these together and you bring a few more things in, we could have a pretty rich and deep understanding of what's happening in the 1760s, anticipating this age of revolution. I mean, my view is that when you teach Cars and Brown together, sorry to refer to myself in the third person, but when you teach Cars and Brown together, you're really deepening our understanding of what the age of revolution is, what it's about, and who's involved, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I
because
was sorry.
Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say about the question of the sort of the particular people involved. I was struck that sort of Corribanti, Amina people were central to both of these, and I'm wondering if you could sort of speak to that in terms of the particularity of that group's history. Both as sort of how you interpreted it as being significant to the stories you're telling, but also as sort of a problem of how do we, if we want to do that bridge, we want to build that hinge, whatever kind of metaphor we want to do between West African history and the Caribbean, the Americas, it's really sometimes really tricky to know how to get at that, right? Because I mean, these identities, as you both know, I mean, they tell us a lot about where the Europeans picked up the enslaved people. They tell us a lot less about where these enslaved people were really from. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that in terms of how you managed sort of that aspect of your interpretation, linking, Coromantee, Amina, culture, history, politics with these stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of kind of reading what you know against what other people know. Start with that, the kind of historiographical move, which is, I'm very influenced by works like John Thornton's on the Coromantee, by Robert Hansard's work on the Coromantee, by Walter Rucker's work on the Gold Coast, by Kwasi Konadu's work on the Gold Coast, on the Akan diaspora in the Americas. So kind of and then of course, in the sources themselves, we've got Dutch and Danish and British sources, especially on relations in the Gold Coast. And so a deep reading of what's happening up within those forts and in those trading relations kind of gives you a sense of the patterns of trade, even in the interior. It's never perfect, of course. We're historians. We don't get that. But you can develop a sense of kind of when the opportunities are created by wars between different African polities for the trade in persons down to the forts. So if you look closely enough and situate that within our broader understanding of what's happening, I should have mentioned Rebecca Shumway as well, which is a crucial book. You can kind of develop a sense, as I said, of the kind of particular African history, especially if you're focused enough in time on the 1730s, 40s, 50s. You can have a pretty good sense of like where these people are likely to have come from at particular places and times. Now, that's a different question than the question of how they identify. Related to, but not the same question of how they identify, right? Because oftentimes these are polities at war. They're expansionist polities on the Gold Coast. They're polities that are trying to dodge or evade them. There are shifting territorial boundaries. People are moving around, and they're learning a lot of each other's cultural practices, mores, and making different identifications in this tumultuous environment. And the making of those different identifications, the making of belonging, doesn't just stop when they are transferred over to the Americas. That process continues. But by focusing on it as a process, right, not something static, not assuming that Coromantee identity is going to have the same content or be subject to the same kind of logic in various places and various times, then we can begin to, again, focus on the process itself and use the indication of Coromantee belonging as an opportunity to talk about the process and how the process compels people to reform and reshape their identifications. And this is something I think Walter Rucker's book, Gold Coast Diasporas, does really well and helps me to think that process through. What I added to that was just thinking very precisely about the people who might have been involved in Tackies Revolt and the other campaigns around Tackies Revolt, how they might have been experiencing that world of tumultuous warfare in Africa before they came.
Yeah, Vince does a wonderful job, I think, in the chapter you have on Coromantee of figuring out what was going on in Africa and how that affected what happened in Jamaica. In the Berbice rebellion, the people who are considered to be the leadership of the rebellion are what the Dutch call Amina, who are the same folks as Coromantee, Gold Coast, people who were at least came from the Gold Coast. And one of the things that I see is about a third through these interrogations, the Dutch begin to ask people, what nation are you? And so about, I don't quite remember, but maybe 40 or 50 different nations are mentioned after that, the way people self-identify, or people identify as Creole, meaning that they were born in the New World. And some of those identifications are ones that we have all heard of. Others, who knows what people meant exactly by their nation, could be their village, could be their region, could be. But one of the interesting things to me is that I have seen, and I have done a fair amount of work in the records in Berbice, which are extremely rich. that there is no mention of nations in those records until this rebellion happens. And I think one of the things that happens is that once the rebellion gets underway, these diasporic ethnic identifications become sharpened, become more prominent, and take on a different political meaning, perhaps, than they have had before. I mean, I don't know that for sure because I don't see them before, but the fact that I don't see them before, I think is very interesting. And so the rebellion begins as a coalition between Creoles and Africans, mostly Africans, but a fair number of Creoles. But over time, it becomes increasingly an African affair. And as the pressure on people increases, as there's more hunger, they're running out of guns, they cannot find allies. The Dutch are, with their long Atlantic reach, getting new medication and new guns and new soldiers. You see that, as in all movements, there is more fighting among different ethnic groups, and the fighting seems to very much sort of follow sort of broad patterns in the Dutch slave trade. And so, in part because my evidence was so rich about what happens in Berbice itself, I do much less than Vince does with what happens in Africa. And his book came out as mine was already in production, which is a real pity, I think. But I nevertheless think that many of the broad ideas are there in both. That yes, it did make a difference, and I think people's African ideas also shape their vision of freedom in various ways. So it's not only their military tactics. I think it's also what they were after and what they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, for anybody specifically interested in the kind of intellectual vision of these Africans in the Americas, I mean, certainly Cars's book is fantastic on this, but also James Sweet's Dominguez Alvarez and the Intellectual History of the African World is a fantastic book, and it was a model for my own thinking as well, even though I wasn't able to push into the intellectual history as well as he was. I have a question on African national identifications in Africa. I'm wondering if in the sources in Berbice, in runaway slave ads, you don't find people's nations mentioned. I found
there
Douglas
are no
Chambers.
newspapers.
Okay, because I found Douglas Chambers is like his database of runaway slave ads for Jamaica very helpful, because even as early as like 1718 or so, you see Coromantee being mentioned in those ads, but we don't have them. Okay.
Yeah, you see that in
the
Sangamon
Dutch
for sure.
community, there's maybe 5,000 enslaved people in Berbice.
Yeah,
on the eve of this revolt. So we're talking, and maybe 350 Europeans. This is very much a frontier place, and that may have something to do with it.
That makes sense. But I certainly think your instincts are right that like conflict will sharpen those identifications, right?
It's like Yugoslavia, in the
the most when the most
or,
important thing is like distinguishing friend from foe, you find lots of axes of identification on which to do it, and they become harder and much sharper in those situations of conflict.
But it is clear that people organize around these ethnic labels, that leaders get their own group of Luango together or their own group of Kanga together, and that matters to them. That organization is built partly by plantation, partly by ethnic affiliation. And the Amina, when the rebellion first break out, they go from plantation to plantation and they pick the Amina out. And they're basically saying, "You're coming.
Who can you trust?
Yeah, you're definitely coming with us." And folk talks and people talk about it that way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me.
Can we sort of pivot on that with sort of Native people? I mean, they play a role in both areas.
More so in
Cars, obviously. And part of that has to do with, I think, the proximity, prior to these wars and the sort of interactions and the role of Indigenous people in sort of the making possible of this settlement in Berbice in terms of trade, in terms of sort of patrols, all of those kind of things. But in general, I guess maybe if not in this specific case, also just in the broader history of the Caribbean or the broader history of enslavement. You think about Indigenous people playing a role as The enslaved themselves, right, playing a role as allies, trade partners with colonizers that make certain kinds of slave systems possible. And then, sort of also allying with people in the African diaspora, right, where there's all kinds of alliances formed in terms of, trading food, in terms of shared settlements, intermarriage, all of those kind of things. And those are sort of three different registers where Indigenous people figure into these sorts of histories, as well as into particular histories that you're writing. So I don't know if each of you maybe want to speak a little bit about where we can. And I guess what's on my mind is this idea of settler colonialism, which is a very helpful tool, but also very flattening in many ways. When you're looking at the complexities, especially beyond just native settler relations, what do we do with that category? How do we think about, Indigenous people in the broader story of slavery and diaspora?
Shall I take that question first, Vince?
I think because you just got much more information on kind of diplomatic relations with Indigenous people in Berbice.
Yeah. I mean, in Berbice, there are about a century before this rebellion takes place in 1763. So in the 1680s, there are a number of strong alliances and revolts by enslaved people in Berbice and native people joining them, sort of anti-Dutch revolts, and both in Suriname and in Berbice, Demerara, or not Demerara, but Essequibo, and the Dutch over time very craftily pull those alliances apart, make these treaties with native people that basically say, listen, if you guys want to keep trading with us and we have a shared interest in native slave trading, then you need to forget about allying with our African slaves. And that is what happened. And so these treaties are made between these powerful independent native groups on the Wild Coast, predominantly Arawak and particularly Carib, who ally themselves with the Dutch around a shared interest in slave trading, native slave trading, which is predominantly women and children. And by helping the Dutch sort of form a cordon around their colony, they make the enslavement of Africans as a viable economic institution possible, because the Dutch are such a tiny number that the only way they can keep a lid on there is if they get native help. And so in the revolt, there are about 350 native people who are enslaved in Berbice, and some of them joined the rebellion. Many of them used the opportunity to disappear, go home, perhaps. But the folks who really helped the Dutch suppress this rebellion are not so much the Dutch soldiers who are bunglers in the jungle, but it's native soldiers who come and cordon off the colony and make it so people can't disappear into the hinterlands. And the difficulty is that our research about native peoples in that part of South America is really very undeveloped. And a ton of research should be done both in Dutch record, but also in Spanish and Portuguese records. I just couldn't manage it given how many sources I already had about the rebellion itself. And so these people, the native people, remain more shadowy than they ought to be. I think that settler colonialism is not such a super helpful way to think about this colony Berbice, which is a colony that's about 100 miles long and probably no more than 4 miles wide. And everything outside of it is still in native hands. The Dutch are afraid to go there. They trade with native people for slaves, but that is, they don't have much influence there whatsoever. It's really more a situation like the 17th century with various Europeans interacting with more powerful nations like the Five Nations than it is settlers interacting with folks who have already largely been reduced to a dominated state. There are some of those in Berbice, but really the main allies are these powerful folks who do not want large numbers of Maroons living in the hinterlands competing for resources and women and trade. and who are very eager in keeping this slave trade going. And so the shared interest in slavery, albeit different slaveries, is really what pulls these people together in very powerful ways, in which ways that you've written about, for New France.
Yeah, it is a great question.
There's just so much more work to be done.
Yeah, I think the same things. I'm really looking forward to Linford Fisher's work on indigenous slavery in the Caribbean, especially that trade from the southeast of the North American continent down into the Caribbean. But as most of you know, there was a population collapse in the 16th century Caribbean, which doesn't mean that the Native Americans were completely wiped out, but it does certainly mean that by the time of Tackies' revolt in the mid-18th century, there aren't really Native American polities on Jamaica that have any distinctiveness. So you find enslaved indigenous people on plantations here and there, and you find them referred to in the law. They don't have their own distinct polities that the British feel they have to negotiate with. But there's another way in which the kind of literature on settler colonialism and relations with indigenous peoples does inform my own work. And that is because I fundamentally saw the British as engaged in diplomatic maneuvers and diplomatic negotiations with the Maroons. As many people know, the Maroons, kind of like who were left behind when the British conquered the island from the Spanish in 1655, kind of went to the hills and continued to harry plantations. People continued to run away from plantations. And then by the time we get to the 1720s and into the 1730s, the British are engaged in what is now called the First Maroon War, which is a full-scale combat operation against the Maroons, in which the British don't know they're going to be able to keep the island, frankly. And they have to sign treaties with them in 1739, which grant the Maroons their relative autonomy in these mountainous and hard to find regions, but also obliges the Maroons to police future slave revolts and return runaway slaves, which they often do. And it is the case, I think, quite clearly that there's no way the British would have been able to defeat the rebels in 1760 and 1761 without the aid of the Maroons that they had secured by treaty. And so those kind of diplomatic agreements, right, that the British are conducting in North America with Native American tribes, trying to pit one against the other, making kind of shifting series of alliances for the purpose of fighting particular campaigns, the British have to do with the Maroons in Jamaica. And so that model for policing and controlling a colonial territory is very much in operation. Now, if we had to kind of invoke the terms of settler colonialist literature, you would say that, in part because the British have an established colony in Jamaica, they had pretty much eliminated, in Patrick Wolf's sense, they had eliminated and exterminated the indigenous people, and were now managing the terms of their own society, notwithstanding what I said about the Maroons.
Well, right. And that whole issue of allies is so absolutely crucial, because the Dutch are very worried that the rebels in Berbice will make somehow connections with Maroons in Suriname, and they immediately, the Surinamese authorities, sent emissaries to the Maroons in Suriname saying, we do hope that you know where your interests lie, and they lie with us. And there's no indication that Maroons in Suriname have an interest in what goes on in Berbice. And then the Berbice rebels very much try to make connections with enslaved people in neighboring colonies, and that, for various reasons, doesn't work either. But without allies, it is extremely hard to win a war. And it's the main reason that I think the Dutch do win in Berbice, because they have this long Atlantic reach that allows them to resupply themselves, but also they have allies. They have soldiers in other places. They have Native American allies, and if it hadn't been for that, I think the rebels in Berbice would have won.
I think you could say largely the same thing for Tackies' revolt. I'm reminded of something that Constantine Dirk said in a conversation with me the other night. He said that one of the things that Tackies' revolt shows, and I think that Marjoleine Carson's book shows so well too, is that oppression is hard work. Right? Oppression itself is hard work. And perhaps one of the problems with a lot of the literature on settler colonialism is that it doesn't take settler colonists seriously enough and their predicament. Now, this isn't a kind of, this isn't a kind of sympathy for the devil that I'm trying to espouse here. It's to really understand that the project of colonizing a place is difficult work, right? It's not just a logic that plays out as it would have things over space and time. One has to see the predicament of these colonists, and I think that Professor Kars's work does that so well. Like, they don't know that they're going to win, and they also have all kinds of maneuvers and strategies and tactics to try and gain advantages that they're not quite sure of, right? We see that especially on the west coast of Africa, right, where these forts along the African coast are there at the sufferance of many of these African polities. There is no question of the British marching up to Ashanti and taking Kumasi in the first half of the 18th century. No chance, right? You have to see that these diplomatic maneuvers and engagements are of necessity for their colonial projects, not just the playing out of a logic which one could determine, as an ism in the first place.
And certainly in Berbice, you see how incredibly divided the colonists are themselves too. Just like the rebels are, they struggle with many of the same issues: dissension in the ranks, shortage of food, fear. They have labor conflicts in the same way that the rebel leader has labor conflicts. I mean, they just don't have. I was reminded again of how in Jamaica the English, the Brits get the Navy to get involved. For instance, the resources in Jamaica are greater than they are for the Dutch. It takes the Dutch forever.
It's one of Britain's principal.
Yeah,
it's one of Britain's principal naval stations in the Americas. I mean, people should know that Great Britain has 3 major naval stations in the Americas. One at Halifax, Nova Scotia, right? One at English Harbor, Antigua, and then this big one at Port Royal, Jamaica. Yeah. So what's missing from that are the 13 colonies that become the United States, right? But yes, I mean, like, so much of their military resource is headquartered in the Caribbean, and they have to utilize it. And of course, as one sees in Professor Kars's story, one sees in Jamaica during Tackies revolt, desertions increase among sailors when they're combating this revolt. There are all kinds of disciplinary problems that require exertions of force and coercion on the part of the British military, just as the enslaved rebels have to do for their part.
Yeah, well, excellent. Thank you. So we're going to shift now. We have about a half hour, a little under. We've gotten a few questions in, and the first one, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. It came in when we were having the conversation about slave versus enslaved. Mm-hmm. And this was a question that sort of built on that, about slave holder, slave owner versus enslaver. This is what I've been kind of questioning myself in the sense that, at least in my work, I'm trying to make a distinction between the process of enslavement and then the process of holding on to people who are enslaved. There's a very different dynamic involved in those two things. In a lot of indigenous slave systems, of course, enslavement is the key thing. It's very local, it's very small, it's very personal, and it's the act of enslavement that's the key thing, not the sort of productive holding on to slaves. And so I think there's an intellectual payoff for keeping those distinctions. But on the other hand, of course, I see, the reason why enslaver is used, because keeping someone in slavery is sort of a constant re-enslavement, right? So I'm just curious about this anonymous questioner is curious about that from the two of you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of reiterate in a different way what I had said before, which is the way one characterizes these processes kind of plays out over multiple words and sentences and paragraphs, because they're processes. A single static word is not going to ever really fully satisfactorily encapsulate the processes we're trying to explore. So one can replace, slaveholder with enslaver. Is that going to do it? Is that going to suggest on its own everything we're trying to get across in what you just said? I'm unconvinced, and I think that it's got more purchase as a kind of politics of etiquette in writing than it does as a real analytical description of these various processes we're trying to get at. No, I'm not saying there aren't better and worse words to choose. I like to be very careful with my words as well. but I think there's too much hope placed upon the selection of kind of one word to describe all the things we're trying to get across. That's all I was saying.
Yeah, I would agree with Vince there. And I also think that sometimes I mean, I use words somewhat interchangeably, partly for writing purposes, but also because every time you use a different word, it makes people think about it for another second. Like, oh, it's like what Peter Wood did years ago, Vince. Remember when he wrote an article about where he used the word slave labor camps? That is only now people are beginning to use that. He did that 30 years ago. I remember when I gave a talk in the Netherlands about 10 years ago, used that word. Afterwards, people came up to me and said, that kind of American fad kind of thing doesn't go here. Just call it a plantation. I used the word in the book a couple of times just because I want to jolt people and have them think about it. White readers, black readers don't need that jolt, but white readers do. And so I think different words at different times can all have their purpose. I agree we should think about them, but if we put too much hope in them, I think Vince is exactly right. We're going to be disappointed.
All right, thank you. Next question. It's really interesting. It asks about the role of animals in revolts and rebellions. So for metaphysical purposes, dogs on the side of the enslaves, and then the person just gave a caveat of not having read the book. So really interested to have you speak to the role of animals.
I've seen no references to dogs in the Berbice records. The only time I saw it is a year before the big rebellion. There's a much smaller one, and the enslaved rebels there attack an Indian trading post, and clearly the guy in charge of the post has hunting dogs, and there's a mention of they shoot all his hunting dogs, but that is the only time I have seen dogs mentioned. So the image, that I mean, people have done fascinating work on the way dogs were used, both in the colonies and in the islands to hunt people down. I've seen none of that here.
In Jamaica, you see that more with the Second Maroon War in the 1790s. The British bring dogs from Cuba to hunt people. I don't see that happening in Tackies revolt, or at least I haven't found much evidence of it. I think there might be reference to a barking dog, but doesn't really come into the story much. You certainly find that the mounted militia, tend to be more successful than the foot militia at suppressing the revolt, and then horses in that sense matter. But I didn't write much about it. I don't, as a kind of independent analytical focus, animals didn't really come in for much comment in my work.
Yeah, and I think at least in the smaller maroon settlements or other things, it's pretty hard to keep domesticated animals, right? I mean, you're trying to find this garden plots and things like that are.
But chickens. I mean, chickens are certainly there. Pigs in the Caribbean, of course. I mean, the Spanish had basically left pigs all over the Caribbean islands, so that when they stopped at various islands, they would have a source of food to hunt. And these pigs were incredibly destructive to the local landscape, and that was one of the things that also facilitated the reduction of the indigenous population. But I don't find them playing a significant role in the revolt of 1760 and 61.
I did see animals like turkeys and chickens playing a role, in the sense that when Governor Kofi is consolidating his hold over the colony, he sends people from plantation to plantation to sort of take stock of what animals are where because of food. Because of food, and people get very upset. They do not want their chickens and so on taken. And so to some extent, I think there's something to be said for animals not having agency, but playing a role in people's decision on how are they going to react to this rebellion, at least initially, when they very much want to keep those precious food supplies for themselves and save them from the rebels' barbecues.
Oh yeah, now that we're talking about food, we can talk about plants as well, right? Because one of the things that the British do is they begin to cut down all the plantains and the food crops that rebels might employ. And then, of course, one of the disciplinary problems they have is that kind of soldiers leave the campaign and go and try to loot plantations of food crops because they're hungry too. So, so yeah, food is kind of fundamental to the progress of these campaigns and sourcing food.
All right, thank you. So next question has to do with disabilities and injuries. The question is sort of how were disabilities and injuries interpreted, both due to labor violence versus due to the violence related to conflicts or resistance?
Yeah, I don't have much on that. Basically, kind of what I have in certainly the naval records are people who are discharged because they're ill or infirm or disabled, and they become unavailable to military commanders in the course of the war. But I didn't do much with the interpretation of that. I mean, it just kind of it wasn't an analytical focus of mine.
In Berbice, no doubt, as in Jamaica, certainly disease plays a huge role.
Yeah.
In part, of course, because European soldiers die like flies, but also because the rebels and formerly enslaved themselves suffer from exposure, hunger, diseases begin to spread. And disease becomes a huge issue on both sides, trying to keep people healthy, trying to keep them from dying from disease. There are regularly mentions of people getting hurt, of course, in the records in Berbice, both people getting shot on both sides by each other in military engagements, but also people talking about injuries that were done to them by rebels who came and wanted them to join and they didn't want to, or heartbreaking stories about people saying we were trying to hide and we were in the water, somebody's baby began to cry and we were really afraid and so we drowned that baby. I mean, so there's all kinds of mentions in the Berbice records to injury and to disease and to disability. Also, at some point, when the Dutch begin to take the colony back, the soldiers go from plantation to plantation, and everywhere the people are gone. But the very ill people are usually still there. And they will sometimes take these people onto the ships, and in other cases they'll say, oh, we found this 10-year-old girl. We think she has a contagious disease. We just had to leave her there because, we can't run that risk. So again, heartbreaking stories where they talk about people having various diseases that they can or cannot deal with.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, in my book, there are lots of people who are kind of disabled in various ways. But if you want a kind of real analytical study of disability in Caribbean slavery, there's Stephanie Hunt Kennedy's Between Disability and Death, Between Fitness and Death, excuse me, which is a fantastic book on disability and slavery and the way that people interpret disability in the context of slave society in the British case for that book.
Yeah, thanks. Also, Jennifer Barkley, is her book out? I mean, I think it's out.
I don't know that one.
It's not set in the Caribbean. I think it's in North America. But again, it's about disability and slavery. I was thinking in the Martinique rebellion that I'm studying right now, there's a lot of emphasis on noting the scarification from former acts of punishment. In other words, when they're in an interrogation, the first thing they'll mention about one of the people being interrogated is if they've had some mark of having been a runaway or having been, in other words, it sort of imbues them with this, we know they're a bad character. This person has run away before. This, they might have a fleur-de-lis, they might have a cropped ear. Sometimes, they in the early, the first decade of the 18th century, they started clipping noses. Which was this brief thing that they tried, and it was horrific. They stopped doing it because it ended up being the risk of death was so high. But anyway, this is just another way that I was thinking about this idea of disability and marking as sort of a way of mapping onto people sort of these judgments about their obedience, their docility, etc.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's part of the semiotic landscape of slavery, a fundamental part of it.
Right.
And beheadings become a big part in
Yeah.
warfare. I think where in Berbice certainly to bring the head of your slaveholder is a sign that you might want to be you might become a leader in the rebellion. That's how you.
Yeah, and now that
by the same token, the
think of
Dutch are forever cutting off heads and putting them on poles,
as
as
do the
part
British.
of that semiotic.
Yeah, that's kind of, everybody's in on that game.
And
and now that I
corpses,
think of it, like
absolutely.
the bounty that slaveholders required from Maroons to prove that they had killed a number of rebels were ears. So
right,
they would
bring their
collection of
right?
ears to the British.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Berbice, it's hands. Yeah.
Right. All right. Next question is Kimberly Jones asks, have you seen sources that suggest that captives aboard ships also consider themselves at war with their captors? Is the language of war related to slavery? Is it restricted by land or geography? Or landed geography, rather. Sorry about that.
Good question. No, so there's a really good case of a shipboard rebellion in that's in like late 1720s off the Gold Coast, in William Snellgrave's account, and there it's very clear that the Africans feel themselves to be at war with the British, right? They're at war with the enslavers, I should say, not necessarily the British in particular, but there's at least Snellgrave reports that someone says, you're a great rogue to enslave me, and that's why I'm revolting.
Mm-hmm.
I think the physical, putting up of the barricades and all these kind of things. I mean, it's a kind of evidence of at least how the ship captains and others viewed the understanding of the enslaved. I mean, it's.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus Rediker's slave ship, you see how the slave ships were retrofit to be floating garrisons in his terms, right? They were ships of war. So I think so.
All right, Jesse Cromwell first. Heaps praise. He says, love both of these books. But then how would you fit your books within the recent boom of literature on marinage, specifically maritime marinage? Do known pathways of escape in the Caribbean make violent revolts appear more representative or exceptional in regard to the resistance of the enslaved?
Well, does maritime marinage include riverine marinage? Because in Berbice, it's all about the river, right?
It is all about the river. I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I think that in Berbice, when people run away, they don't use the river, in fact. They inevitably try to make their way north, south, east, west, hoping to make their way to beyond Demerara and Essequibo towards the Spanish, or further into the hinterlands. They don't usually go east towards Suriname, and they don't. When they go south, they use the river for a little while, but then they disappear into the jungle. There is the sense that in Suriname there are virtually no big rebellions, and that it's in part because the option of marronage was available to people because there's so many different groups of Maroons. In Berbice, that is absolutely not the case, partly because it is so tiny and everything around it is native land. So what you see there is that people try to make their way west and are almost inevitably hunted down with the help of native people. And there's not a great sense of there being Maroon communities in Berbice. I've seen no references to them before the rebellion. There's some reference to them after.
Okay.
Sorry, I was. Okay, yeah. One of the questions just has to do with people not having sound. So it seems like that's probably not something we can help with, but hopefully there's some way for.
I don't seem to be on mute. I don't know. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you fine. I think it's more of a technical issue, not with us. I think it's a broader problem with the platform. So I'm going to try, if I can, to see.
I'll tell you what, whoever's listening, I didn't have sound when I first turned in, and I had to plug in the headphones. And I know that the speakers on my computer work, so that maybe something in the platform that if you plug in your headphones and try, it might work.
Okay. I mean, just in terms of the maritime question, I just took a quick peek at some documents for Martinique after I had read about Berbice, because of course it's not that far, and there's smugglers that go between that area and Martinique all the time, including indigenous people who leave the Orinoco and themselves paddle up to Martinique. There's an indigenous slave trade that's going on. There's sort of all kinds of contraband trade. And I did see an account, just a summary of the account. I didn't have time to read the whole account, of a couple of ships that had arrived in 1763, or maybe 62, in Martinique. Would the timing of that work in terms of people coming away from Berbice?
Well, the rebellion, the big one, doesn't break out till 1763.
Right? Yeah, 63. But I guess I bring that up just because in a 2-minute search, I could find in French records an echo or reverberation of this. There are discussions, obviously, in Saint-Domingue about Tacky. The people are really concerned about it, obviously, and this really brings up a question I want to ask, since there are no other questions from the audience, about sort of the circulation of either people or ideas or concerns, rumors around these regions of the potential revolts, of actual revolts. And I'm sort of thinking of Julia Scott's Common Wind, obviously, but also, out of Ferrer, there's this whole idea of the spread of these ideas into Cuba before any of the official reports have arrived, right? So you have the circulation, and I'm just wondering if that part of the story, or that part of sort of the Caribbean and the dynamic there, affects the way you saw your particular story, or if there's something about that.
So I'm a huge fan of Julia Scott. I arrived for graduate school at Duke when he was still teaching there, and did a couple of courses with him. And so I'm enormously influenced by his dissertation, The Common Wind, which is now the book that's been published finally in 2018. I think that's a huge, still expanding area of research, because that work is so hard. It's so needle in a haystack, trying to trace out all of these different circuits of news and communication, and then try to figure out kind of what difference that made. So I did a little bit of that in the final chapter of Tackies' Revolt, what I called Roots of Reverberation. Certainly a lot of the exiles from Tackies' Revolt went to what was then British Honduras, what's now Belize. And we know that there was a slave revolt in British Honduras in 1765, probably including many of these people who had experience and had been exiled from Tackies' Revolt. I did some work just from shipping records, tracing out people who had been exiled from Jamaica to North America. One ship that was consigned to Norfolk, and I followed the convoy all the way up to Norfolk, and I know the bill of lading had said this ship was laden basically only with Negroes. But then when I got to the customs records for Virginia, Negroes weren't listed on the ship. Mm-hmm. So either because there were special taxes on imports from the Caribbean, because people already knew that there had been a revolt in the Caribbean, they were just kind of smuggled in past the customs official and not declared on the import records, or they had been dropped off somewhere along the way. But so that's the kind of research we're doing, is trying to figure out the timing following those ships that moved around point by point by point by point. And it's just a huge area of really grinding social historical research that I think we have to do. But I think it's worth it ultimately, because we know that there were people who were exiled as a result of being tried for Tackies' Revolt that went directly to Virginia in 1760. Now the question is, can we pick them up in Virginia somewhere? Or I was able to track the importation of 9 people into South Carolina, right?
Mhm.
From the same cargo of ships that left in a convoy. What happens in South Carolina? Can we pick them up in South Carolina? We know that people were telling the story of Tackies revolt for decades in Jamaica. And we also know that many people were exiled from Jamaica in that intervening period to Saint-Domingue. So it wasn't just the planters that were worried about it. It was also enslaved people in Saint-Domingue that knew of what had happened in the 1760s in Jamaica and therefore knew what was possible. Now, can we attribute the start of the Haitian Revolution to what happened in Jamaica? No, but we know that we can be pretty sure from circumstantial evidence that the enslaved were aware of it. But I still think there's a lot more research to do there.
I guess I'm old enough to best you a little bit, Vince, here, because I was when I came to Duke as a grad student, Julius still was a grad student himself. In the case of Berbice, the Dutch are way too cheap to ban people at the end. But initially, when the revolt happens, some people flee with their enslaved people to neighboring colonies. And within 2 weeks of the revolt breaking out, letters arrived from Suriname, from the governor in Suriname, saying to the Dutch governor, don't let your people write any more letters to Suriname, because the slaves here are already singing songs about what's happening in Berbice, and they're singing them with a lot of glee, and we cannot have that because, you know, we're a lot bigger than you. And so the news spreads very quickly. And I also think that for people like Governor Kofi, who's starting these negotiations, that he's inspired not only by what he may have learned as a child in West Africa, but also by the treaties the Dutch have just concluded with Maroons in neighboring Suriname. So there's definitely ways in which people have heard about what in other places people are trying to do to secure their freedom. But that is all I have been able to find. I was really looking for it. But again, I think if, St. Eustatius, which is where people first go when they leave Berbice, has been barely studied. I think if people were to go into those records, who knows what they would find out from those ships that came from Berbice with, worried colonists, some of whom brought some of their enslaved people with them.
Right. Well, we only have a couple more minutes, but we do have 2 questions. What I want to do is just pose them both quickly, and we have about 3 or 4 minutes to answer them. One question has to do with the West African literature that's been mentioned has been largely by North American scholars, and so the question's about sort of what is the role? Are there West African scholars who have done this kind of work, or is there something we can speak to in that regard? And then the second one is about sort of experiences with local populations. There were a couple of places where you each talked about being in the place, and so that's the second question. So either of those, if you could speak to either of those.
So the first, very quickly, is the go-to source for the history of slavery in the Gold Coast in the pre-colonial period is Akosua Perbi's Indigenous Slavery in Ghana. And she's a Ghanaian scholar that is kind of working there. Also, I would highly recommend the history of Ashanti Kings, which is an oral history that's been kind of edited together by my colleague Emmanuel Champong. So those 2 sources, I think, are kind of fundamental to helping think about the history of certainly for that part of the Gold Coast in the period that's in question. The second question was about kind of local people and what they know of this history. I have been in contact with a local activist named Derek Black X Robinson, who has been lobbying for Tacky to be made a national hero. And so we've kind of done a number of events with Black X to try and kind of raise awareness of these events in Jamaica, including a radio show by the dub poet Muta Baruka. That was last year. We did his radio show together. So kind of engaged and involved with people who care about this history in Jamaica. But I have not done much oral history among the Maroons. For that, I would recommend people go to Ken Bilby's book, True Born Maroons, which is deeply engaged with oral history.
In my case, Kofi has been named a national hero in Guyana. But I think that people in Guyana are very eager to learn more about him and about this rebellion. And my main thing when I have given talks there online has been people saying, we want those records. They're in The Hague. We want to read them. Of course, they're in Dutch, so we want them translated. And in fact, I was able to put a group in Guyana together with the Dutch archives in The Hague, and they are in fact going to translate a number of these records about the rebellion into English, so that both scholars, but particularly Guyanese, can make some determinations of their own about what happened in this rebellion, and they don't have to rely on a Dutch American.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, thank you to both of you, and thank you to our audience for showing up. This is a pair of amazing books. I'm truly impressed by the research, the writing, the engagement with, such a huge historiography. So why don't we give them a hand and thank them for their presentations. And I guess in the chat we're going to see some claps. I assume I see some claps coming. So thanks everybody.
Just a note out to Sophie White. Thanks for that source on the 8 people who fled Jamaica in 1765 and ended up in Louisiana. We need much more of that. Kind of like we stack up enough of those needles that we pull out of the haystacks, we might be able to sew something.
That's right. And thanks very much, Brett, for chairing this. And thanks to Vince for hanging in there. And
always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Marjoleine, and with you, Brett. Thanks so much.
All right. See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye all.